Welcome back to football weather. Although you wouldn't know it from being outside right now here in the Midwest. It's hot. It has been a hot last month and a half, basically. A lot of rain. Whenever it rains heavily, that's probably I feel like it rains with football, but that's the least football weather-ish type of football as far as I'm concerned. Like, it just kind of ruins the game in a lot of ways. Matt Blaska, what we want sunshine, we want crisp clouds, we want picturesque skies. Snow is okay, but rain is just not really football weather.
It is the farthest thing from football weather. I just got back, as you know. I just mowed the grass this morning in the dew point. It was 81 degrees, and I went through 2 shirts. It was brutal. It was not a fun day to mow, and looks like we got rain again here in Bloomington. So
yeah, we were supposed to start 10 minutes ago, and I had to ask for an extension because I was also trying to finish mowing the lawn before the rains come. It feels like you are hacking your way through a jungle out there, and it's around the corner. I think we're going to have some nicer weather, hopefully, at some point. Although it's funny, here in Indiana, and this is something I've noticed, there's several other college football places have to deal with this. Mm-hmm. But we always now seem to get at least one hurricane remnant affected game. Last year it was the Maryland game. Of course, famously, go back to the Virginia game from 7 or 8 years ago, and it's an absolute just if there was dirt in Memorial Stadium, it would have been a mud bath, but instead it was just essentially a pond.
Yeah.
And that's happened a ton. And I know obviously there are Southern schools that deal with it more, but it's, again, not something that anybody roots for when you go into the season. You look for the snow games. You don't look for the heavy rain games.
Yeah, it's something no one wants to sit through it. You make other plans. I believe we watched the Virginia game together. We were planning on going, and then that storm rolled in. I forget what the storm was even called, but there was just a flood going through your backyard that day. But we sat there and watched that game. I don't know what the final score was, but it was a brutal game to watch.
That was famously the game where Tom Allen kicks the trash can excitement at the end while he's high-fiving the IU feds. A simpler, more innocent time. Anyway, we've got a ton to get to here on Football Weather. Of course, if this is your first time listening to Football Weather, this is one of the newest shows in the Back Home Network. Matt and I covering college football nationally from the perspective of not the Southeast. And I think that that's an important distinction for the show. Not that we are insensitive to the desires and the wants of the Southeast, but I feel like that dominates so much of the discourse in college football talk, Matt. And these last couple of weeks have been no exception to that dominance in terms of narrative. So we got a lot to talk about. We're going to dive right in and start off by discussing what we saw at Big Ten Media Days, how that compared to what we saw at SEC and ACC Media Days. And a lot of it really revolves around, as I think you put in the show notes, Tony Petitti and the Big Ten's playoff crusade involving out-of-conference games, the playoff, and what their end game is. So I wanted to get your thoughts on this first. The talking points in the Big Ten were clearly, hey, SEC really needs to go to 9 games at the conference level, or we're going to stay right where we're at in terms of the playoff. Obviously, there's some pushback from certain circles in the SEC on that. Mm-hmm. But ultimately, the Big Ten drew a line in the sand this week, and it was interesting watching the national reaction to that.
Yeah, so I as I mentioned earlier, I was away, but I got to kind of catch up on some of the conversation. We were, texting back and forth. So some of the things I think that Petitti mentioned that I think were really important, and I think these are good points that he's made. And this goes for every conference that's out there, is you're not playing a balanced schedule, right? Whether the SEC, the Big 12, the SEC, the Big 10, you're playing around 50 to 60% of the entire conference. So his whole point was, well, we're in the Big 10, you're only playing 9 of the 17 teams, so it's going to create this imbalance regardless. And it creates a huge variance, as we saw last year with IU. It happened how the schedule broke. They played a lot of the lower half of the teams, and some teams played, like Illinois had to play Oregon, they had to play Penn State, they had to play a tougher schedule. So his point there is right. There needs to be a more uniform approach to scheduling. And his point of SEC, hey, if we're going to go to a a model that is not AQ heavy, there needs to be more assurances that X, Y, and Z needs to happen. Did Tony do the best job of laying it out there? It didn't really. I don't think he did a great job of selling it to the national media. And I'll just point out a couple of things where he lost me. Personally, is like, what is this format actually going to look like? We had no real plan. We had no real. Well, the SEC gave their manifesto. There was no manifesto out there from the SEC from Tony Petitti. And it comes off of, hey, this is more TV related compared to maybe just actually on the field. Mentioning Iowa was really interesting. Mentioning Iowa, as we've seen Iowa play, the punt T-shirts, and they're going 6-3 or 8-4 overall, right? Is that something that you really want as a football fan? For, again, we're from Indiana here. We play here. Indiana would have had to play them in a playing game, right? If that was the format, and an 8-4 Iowa team would have traveled to Bloomington. Is that what we want? Is that something that the fans want, right? Not that the fans ever really mattered at any point for this stuff. And then the biggest thing to me was then what happens to non-con. And as we saw, Kurt said, hey, we're going to just schedule like the SEC. We're going to play our basically our warm-up games, and then we're going to play our conference games. And that's what's really going to matter. If that is the case, then why not add a 10th conference game or play these games? Like, there's no reason for a coach like this year. We have Texas and Ohio State. If we were in this AQ format, why would either of these schools play their stars? Not saying they're not going to do it, but why would they play their stars more than a half? And why would they play that game? So you really lose the incentive here in September, and you kind of lose the sport. And that's something that I don't think Tony did a good job of selling, of why these things are important. And then you had Lincoln Riley, I'll just bring him into the fold here real quick, talking about how the Notre Dame SC game is basically an exhibition game. And that's the last thing I think you really want as a college football fan, is hearing how these other games aren't going to matter. And that's the biggest issue I saw with his comments, is how are you going to make the rest of the schedule and the rest of the teams going to matter during this stretch of, we got 9 conference games. These are the games that matter. And what college football fans want, and we'll talk about this more later, is different than what I think Tony wants compared to maybe what the other commissioners want.
So, and we're going to get to this in, like you said, in greater detail later, because I honestly don't think a lot of college football fans know what they want. They are to some degree conditioned to oppose change in almost any form and to adhere to the status quo. And while that is in the best interest of some of those fans, I think for a lot of fans, it's actually not. But I want to take a time out on that thread and come back to some of the things that you were talking about. I agree, in the moment, the way that Petitti tried to lay it out didn't sound ideal, but I think it's because he did a bad job of setting the scene. And the way that the scene needed to be set was kind of how Curt Cignetti said it about 30 minutes later when he got on stage. And I was struck by how Cignetti and a couple of other coaches, I thought Ryan Day also to some degree addressed it fairly straightforwardly. They really distilled it down to, we need to have consistency if we're going to have a college football playoff that relies upon a committee that's supposed to take these criteria and evaluate them and make selections. And a lot of the mantra was, take it out of the committee's hands as much as you can. And people interpreted that as a criticism of the committee. What I interpreted it as was, why are we leaving to chance or to the interpretations of things something that we could just have more standardized across college football? Because there's not really a good reason why there shouldn't be some more standardization in terms of how scheduling operates. And the fact that Cignetti, not Petitti, I believe, at least I don't think I heard Petitti talk about this, brought up, let's have a Big Ten SEC challenge every year where we've got these teams playing each other. That would be something that would be of interest to fans, and that would be of interest to the sport, and would both generate money and give good opportunities for teams to match up against each other. When you start talking about Iowa and whoever else being in contention for a playoff bid because they win a 3-6 game, that is going to lose people unless you set the scene of, look, there is a real distinction, whether we want to like it or not, between a lot of the teams in the Big 12, a lot of the teams in the ACC, and the teams in the Big 10 and the SEC, just purely from a financial perspective. I sent you an article a couple of days ago detailing the severe problems that Iowa State is going to have. They've had to cease renovations of Hilton Coliseum. They had to cease building a wrestling practice facility. They've had to increase costs for season ticket holders, including no longer like picking up the sales tax on the tickets that they're buying. And that even with that, they are going to be 5 years from now in a situation where they could rack up $100 million in debt very easily, just trying to stay at the same financial level as the Big Ten and the SEC. So I think that the way you have to go about this is saying the sport is different now, and it's different for a bunch of reasons. And the idea that ultimately the financial barriers are important, even more so now because teams have to pay players according to the House settlement, that there has to be an accounting for that. And you can't have, going back to the scheduling issue, you can't have a situation where one of the top two conferences is playing fewer conference games. And yes, they can schedule a big non-conference opponent, or they could not. And ultimately, they're still being judged in almost exactly the same way. And like, to me, if Petitti had laid it out that way, you could grouse about the particular proposal, but I don't think you could complain about the premise. And that is where I feel like the SEC has an advantage in the national conversation, because people are still relying on the premise that college football is somehow the same today that it was 20 years ago. And it's just simply not.
Yeah, and I mean, that's a great point. And you're right. If he somehow laid it out, hey, here's, like I mentioned in the first, here's the roadmap of why this works better. And we talked about this live podcast. The problem right now is we have an end of 1 year of doing this, and so they're relying on all this data. And it's, to me, like I said this to others, and maybe too, this is an Indiana problem. If Indiana doesn't go 11-1 last year, the conversation probably totally shifts for the SEC and all these other schools. Indiana, it all worked out for them how it's going to work out.
Right. That's
part of what you guys did by killing the Pac-12 and all these other things that happened to your conference going from 12 to 16 to 18 to potentially 20 teams, which we'll talk about here. And I'm just going to, just a point from last year, the Big Ten had a very imbalanced schedule regardless. There was only 6 teams that were 6-3 or better. So Iowa was the demarcation line, where the SEC, 2, 4, 6, 9 teams were 5 or 3 and better. That's a problem, right? If you have one more game, you probably delineate those a little bit more. Again, you and I are both researchers. Ends of one are not a good thing,
right?
But if we're looking at the 1 year last year, that was a problem. So, and I can't even imagine like the SEC fan base, if they had this AQ model, trying to, whoever was the 7th place team having to now go having to go into the AQ field, they're not going to get the opportunity to play that extra game. So, like you said, there has to be uniformity across the board. We can't have this where these larger conferences exist. You need to play a higher percentage of the teams in the conference.
Well, the other issue, though, and you're right. Well, I mean, you said I was right, so it's disingenuous for me to then say, hey, you're right about me being right. But the other thing about this that I struggle with is Lincoln Riley gets criticized for saying, essentially, well, we don't have to play Notre Dame if it's going to impact our chances. And the big rallying cry was, well, you want to play Notre Dame, USC if it doesn't have any meaning. But then the thing that frustrates me about that is you got to pick a lane. And this is where I think the Big Ten needs to be more straightforward in saying this. People criticized Indiana last year for going 11-1. People criticized SMU for winning against a weak schedule as well. Those same people were advocating for South Carolina and Alabama to make the playoff at 9-3, having lost games. And whatever the advocacy was, the committee looked at those resumes and said, you should not get in. We need to prioritize wins. Now, this is where the larger question of what is best for college football and how things have changed and how we've got to start changing our mindset factors in. But if I'm the Big Ten and I'm saying, well, to some degree, we got lucky that we had that many teams, 4 teams that were legitimately in contention for the playoff. Because if Indiana doesn't have a historic season, maybe you only get 3 teams in to the playoff. Well, that's because we're still prioritizing win total above all else. We're prioritizing it above when the games were played, where the games were played, the quality of the opponents. The fact that South Carolina and Alabama were even in the conversation is kind of silly if you go back and you look at the games that those teams actually won and the games that they lost. And this idea that you were arguing for South Carolina, where, yes, they beat Texas A&M and they beat Mizzou and they beat Clemson. One of those teams made the playoff. That was it. Like, this was not exactly a murderer's row of wins, and they lost the other games that they had on the schedule, and yet they were still being advocated for off of a completely different set of criteria. And that's ultimately the point. Whether or not you think that the 9-3 South Carolina team and the wins that they had should have been selected above SMU and Indiana, the problem is that you are now relying on a group of people to try to parse that based upon an outdated perception of what college football is supposed to be. And that's where, even though the messaging hasn't been great from Petitti and the Big Ten, it is something they need to advocate for. Now, did you get a chance to listen to Ari Wasserman and Andy Staples' podcast about this yet?
I listened to parts of it. The one with Heather Dinich, or which one?
No, the one where they were replaying Lincoln Riley's comment.
Yes, I did. Yeah, that was good. Yeah,
So
I did.
I thought that, and I mentioned this on Crimson Cast, I thought that what they were intimating there was interesting, which is that Sankey and SEC leadership actually do want to go to a 9-game schedule. And it's the coaches that are rebelling against it, not because it's good for the game, but it's good for them to not have to play a 9th game on the schedule. And as you said, give some definition between a 6-3 team and a 5-4 team versus a 5-3 team, which you could legitimately argue was essentially the equivalent of a 6-win team. Like, what do you think about that? Do you believe that Sankey and the SEC really do want to go to a 9th game if they get paid for it?
Yeah, I mean, I think Andy has been on this for a couple of years, and he always talks about, like, Sankey's always wanted this 9th game, but the coaches have always rebelled because for a while the SEC scheduling was they had the East versus West before Oklahoma, and you were playing the same 6 teams and then 7 teams and then one crossover. So if you were Georgia, you were playing those same sets of schools, and every so often they would play, whomever. They still haven't played A&M and A&M yet. I mean, that's just the craziest thing in that conference, right? So, and there's other ones as well. But so yeah, I think they do, and I think Sankey, I sort of do agree with them that they do want to go to this 9th game, but they're not going to do it because the Big Ten told them to do it. Like, I think they said they want to do this because they see the path forward for their conference in their eyes without having to listen to the Big Ten. But they need the Big Ten to make this happen, right? Otherwise, we're going to be a stalemate, and they have essentially 3-4 months here to go forward. Otherwise, we're at 12. And honestly, I'm okay with the 12. I thought it worked great the seating thing, whatever. But maybe if you let something breathe for more than 2 seconds, maybe you actually see this actually works instead of going to 16 right away.
I mean, the issue is ultimately you leave so much money on the table.
Yeah.
If you stay at 12, and should that matter? Whether or not it should matter is immaterial, because it does matter. And ultimately, especially in an era where, going back to the Iowa States of the world, you're staring like economic Armageddon in the face if you don't get more money into the system to pay for revenue sharing and now to pay for NIL. What are your other options as far as generating more money? And so, as much as from a competitive perspective, people are like, we're fine with 12, I don't see a lot of the benefits that 12 provides that 16 wouldn't also provide. You get 4 more teams into the playoff. You expand the interest levels. You obviously generate more money because you've got 4 additional games in that first round. And it also, if you go to that 9th game, if you're the SEC, as we mentioned earlier, sets up a potential challenge situation with the Big Ten. You're going to make a lot of money off of those as well. I mean, last year, or I guess for 2023, 2024, I don't have the numbers from last year. Each of the Power 5 conferences got essentially $80 million from the college football playoff. They got more last year. You're talking about the ability to upgrade this by maybe another 10 or 15%. And that really does matter in terms of the finances of these schools. The other thing I'll note is that when you get down to the way that the way that the scheduling has worked and the way that the structure has worked, to have a situation where you can go into every season with a clear target for everybody, rather than it being a situation where we are entirely locked into this idea of all of this variance from who's good and who's bad. Like you mentioned last year, the Big Ten didn't have a lot of top-level teams. I don't think they're going to have that problem this year. Like their bigger problem, maybe they don't have a top team like Ohio State probably was or Oregon was last year. But it feels like you could have a matchup in the Big Ten championship of two teams with two losses in conference. I think the SEC might be in the same boat. Like I'm just not seeing the level of dominance in any of these teams, or more to the point, I think the floor has been raised for a bunch of these teams from a talent perspective, which could make these conferences more competitive, which again, all leads to this idea that increasing the number of teams in the playoff and increasing the format makes a lot of sense. I keep coming back to this idea that it really does for the SEC. They won't come out and say it. We've heard it intimated a bunch. They just need more money from ESPN to play this ninth game. ESPN is hesitant to do so because why pay more for something you've already got ownership over? But that feels like if that domino can fall, and clearly it hasn't fallen yet, because if it had, we would have heard about it. We're probably going to stay at an impasse until that domino falls.
No, you're right. And so with that said, right, like these decisions all have to happen here very quickly, as there's still no playoff format for 2026. If nothing happens by December 1st, it's the 12 team, the 5+7, which then you have another year or however many years however many years that goes. But like you also, like we've also been saying, like this is a good year it's a really big reset for college football, because there really is no dominant team, whether it is the Big Ten or Notre Dame or the SEC or the Big 12. So it's going to help maybe kind of see what this is actually going to look like when there maybe is more of a middle in the Big Ten, or maybe there is a little more of a middle in the SEC, or maybe it shifts a little bit. But one of those things they need to really kind of sift out is what's that going to look like for the long-term health. And again, I will talk about this later, the health of college football, and to keep fans invested in the sport. So the 16 teams, yes, you keep more fan bases invested, but then you also, once you figure that out, then you got to figure out the calendar, right? The calendar is another issue, as there's limited dates, as we saw, like, IU play Notre Dame on a Friday night in, I don't know, what's the 20th of December, right?
Right.
And the week before, they would have had to play like on a Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. The semifinals were on Wednesday. So that stuff is really important, because you need to figure out a better structure for your playoff, where you're not having these weird gaps. I think James Franklin talked about this. Okay, we had an 11-day break, then a 6-day break, then an 8-day break. There has to be more continuity to make your end of the season more, not look better, but that's the word I'm going to look better throughout. So it's just not kind of thrown together. And I know they already announced the 2027 or 2028, and they're finishing on January 28, whatever that Monday is. I'm like, now we're really getting into the depth of how far this season is going to go. They need to start working backwards to make this a better process.
Yeah, it's going to be complicated to say the least, but time's running out on this. And sometimes that's what you need. You have to get to the deadlines before people will actually do things. The deadlines are coming up pretty quickly.
Yep.
Let's jump gears. Let's change gears. Let's jump to a new topic, and let's talk about this story that emerged a few days ago about North Carolina. So clearly a planted story, not a leak, a planted story that North Carolina was very interested in about 4 years when
sure they were
when the buyout drops and you can leave the ACC for $75 million as opposed to the $150 or whatever $million it is now. But they're very interested in joining the SEC. And there was even some other reporting that intimated that they had some kind of a handshake deal behind the scenes with the SEC. I never believe those things when I first see them, because if they appear out of the blue like that, they're almost always there for a reason. And what benefit does North Carolina have of people knowing this now, other than to try to get the Big Ten interested in giving them a sweeter deal or potential offer? But it does bring up, once again, the specter of realignment. Every time we get done with realignment, more realignment comes. So a couple of things on this in the micro. North Carolina is obviously an attractive school, probably not the most attractive school, but they're in the top 4 of attractive schools of what's out there that's remaining that isn't currently in the Big Ten and the SEC. When you look at that, when you hear that kind of reporting, your thoughts about North Carolina jumping ship and going somewhere else are what?
Not surprising. I mean, we've seen this. We have been staring at ever since the lawsuit was settled that the final one would be $75 million in 2030. I think that's right, the date, right? For Florida State, whoever. Once they settled that was going to be the final number. We all looked at that and said that's when Florida State, Clemson, North Carolina, probably Virginia, and then maybe Miami would be the other school that would be the ones to go or find their next home. And I guess that also puts Notre Dame in a predicament, which I think we slightly talked about too, because now Notre Dame has no more scheduling agreement with a conference that is going to be severely pared down, right? So what does that do to Notre Dame? And where does that fit in terms of the bigger landscape of putting Notre Dame in a conference?
This was the one aspect that I didn't really hear get talked about much about Lincoln Riley's comments about the Notre Dame series. I think I read someone who was talking about this, and they brought up an interesting point. You note who's no longer regularly playing Notre Dame in a year-over-year series? Michigan.
Yep.
And Michigan State.
Right.
Now, they've patched other Big Ten teams into the mix. They obviously had a home-and-home with Ohio State. They had one with Wisconsin. Purdue pops up on their schedule every now and again. Indiana, hypothetically, has got one coming up, but that doesn't start for another 5 years if it ever starts at all. But I think the Notre Dame aspect of this is a really fascinating one, because if you can starve, as you pointed out, the ACC from their legitimacy as a football conference, it makes Notre Dame's deal, which essentially gives them all the benefits of being a member of the college football playoff without any of the drawbacks of being in an actual tough conference. It takes a lot of that away. And it puts Notre Dame in a position where if nobody will schedule them from the Big Ten or the SEC, they've got a real problem on their hands, because the remainder of the ACC post realignment is not going to provide them the kind of schedule boost that they would need, or the games that they would need to win as an independent to overcome the fact that they're not getting an automatic bid out of the conference, and they'll never get an automatic bid out of the college football playoff approach. They're going to always have to play their way into it.
Right. Yeah, there's no scenario that Notre Dame has pushed this can down the road, and they rightfully have done that as long as realignment has happened. But now once, let's say, all 4 of those leave, well, now they're bound to new conference schedules, and let's assume the SEC goes to 9, Big Ten's at 9. They're not going to go out of their way to schedule Notre Dame, and Notre Dame's not going to be saying, "Oh, we'll play Boston College and Syracuse and Wake Forest." Like that's just not going to happen. So you're right. No one's talking about that downhill effect that's going to happen for Notre Dame, but this is probably the pivot point where everyone always says, "Well, they have to join a conference." I think this is probably it, because there's going to be nobody left to play that's going to, as you said, the at large, especially if the at large field's only 3 teams. That really narrows the window, and I doubt they're going to get a look for playing a soft schedule unless they go 12-0, which that was basically their requirement in the BCS era and in the 14 playoff. They basically had to go undefeated. I can't imagine they would do that.
Yeah, it's really a fascinating thing. Now, going back to the North Carolina thing, no. I think it's a part of it, though, because that is one of those programs that it's one of the last programs that really is going to have to use its academic heft, because I think that is rapidly becoming less and less important, because all these conferences already have good academic schools. And as we saw, even the Big Ten, notably, who focuses on that stuff a lot more than the SEC does, had a chance to add Stanford and Cal and voluntarily said, "Nah, we're good." And all of this comes back to an interesting point, which is who remains standing and what do they bring to the table when it comes to future realignment. North Carolina is trying to get out in front early and trying to make themselves attractive as a mover, because I think it's very easy for North Carolina to get lost in the shuffle. Because, look, I don't think Bill Belichick's going to go in there and start rattling off 10, 11 win seasons for however long he's there. And the fact that they've I think they're going to have to hire his son or something like that as head coach afterwards. I wouldn't be too terribly excited about that long-term prospect from a football perspective with UNC. But if you look at, this is a little old, it's a couple years old now, but we don't have all of the more recent numbers. But if you look at this graphic about the highest revenue earning athletic programs in 2023, you go down the list of the highest earners: Ohio State, Texas A&M, Texas, Michigan, Georgia, Nebraska, Penn State, Tennessee, LSU, Alabama, Oklahoma, Wisconsin. I've gone through 12 teams, and they're all in the Big Ten or the SEC, right?
Mm-hmm.
I have to get to 13 to get to the first non-SEC/Big Ten school, and it's Clemson. Then I go SEC with Auburn, Florida, Kentucky, Michigan State. I've got Florida State at 18. Now I'm back on another run of existing Big Ten and SEC schools, and I have to get all the way down to Texas Tech at 26 to find the next non-Big Ten ACC or Big Ten SEC team in revenue. The reason I bring this up is that you look at North Carolina, they're 33rd in revenue produced. Virginia's 32nd. Georgia Tech's 34th. These are not necessarily the most attractive of schools from a revenue perspective, from a ratings perspective. Texas Tech's revenue is high, but their footprint from a television perspective or from a media perspective is not that great. Now, that's not as important as it used to be. But my point in all this is there are a limited number of spots, in my opinion, remaining at the big table in college football. SEC's got 16 teams. Big Ten's got 18 teams. If the SEC added 4 schools and the Big Ten added 2, they'd both be at 20. You'd have 40. That may be it. That may be, and we're seeing this right now at the NBA level, where there's been this big pushback on expansion among NBA owners. They're at 30. They should go to 32. There's clearly interest. But NBA owners don't want to split their media contract more ways than they already are. They'd rather move New Orleans or move somebody else to a new market. That way you're still splitting the media contract 30 ways, not 31 or 32. You'd have to bring money to the table, as we saw with Oregon and Washington, to really make it worth the while of the conferences. And outside of Clemson and Florida State, and we assume Miami, we don't have their numbers because they're a private school, and maybe a Notre Dame, who would certainly bring money and move the needle audience-wise, there aren't a lot of sure bets. And even North Carolina, you're kind of looking at them and you're like, do you really bring enough to the table to make it worth the amount of money that we would be giving up by cutting you in on the deals that we've already set up?
Right. And from that perspective, right, you're looking at right now the only national conference is the Big Ten. So maybe that's maybe the area they want to get into. But you're right, it's limited spots because, and I don't know what Notre Dame would end up doing, but let's say Notre Dame does go to the Big Ten because they want to keep that rivalry with the SC, or that's really important to them. You're looking at one spot for them, right? And who knows if that's actually what they want to do. But back to your point, right? We're getting to the point of the 40 team, let's just call it the Super League, where these are the last 40 teams standing. And North Carolina is making this play now to prepare themselves for 2030, to saying we're available now. What can you provide us as a conference, as a school, to go to your school, or to go to your conference? Well, the conference is, well, what are you providing for us? Like, is that market really? Markets don't matter as much as they used to, like you said. But certainly, neither school or neither conference is in that area or in that state right now. So, right, the limited spots available are going to play a role on who gets next, I guess. And I don't. It's hard to say what North Carolina really is, why they're putting it out there, why this is out there now. But like you said, it's just a bug for the future. How do we, or what happens next for this realignment cycle, and what schools are left, or what properties are going to keep those schools available or keep them allotted to keep going?
I mean, it's not a whole lot different to some degree, in my opinion, from what Curt Cignetti is doing with Indiana. And how his approach has been to keep Indiana in the news, keep Indiana talked about, say things that are a little outlandish, but it's gotten Indiana into a conversation they were never in before. And the perception has to be that you belong at that level. And to me, that's where North Carolina has gone with this. There was some other reporting that, Virginia is also interested. Virginia hasn't said anything. And very few people look at Virginia and say they belong in the national conversation.
Right.
Whereas North Carolina goes out and hires Bill Belichick, maybe a questionable move, but they still went out and did it. They go out and they make this statement through sources about, we'd be very interested in moving to the SEC. They're doing it because they have to maintain an appearance outside that they belong in this conversation. And I think a lot of schools that are throwing a bunch of money at football right now are having that revelation, but don't have that avenue. I mean, I think about the amount of money that Kansas has suddenly started throwing into their football program, or that Colorado has done. Yeah. And yet, I don't know if it's going to be sufficient for either Kansas or Colorado to work their way into the national landscape enough that they would be teams that conferences would be willing to give up shares of their own television and money to provide to bring them into the conference. And so It's just going to be a really fascinating dance as we move forward with all of this.
Yeah, you're right. And the one school, I don't know, we're talking about UNC, is this Texas Tech, as they are throwing their oil money everywhere. Softball and football now, they are picking up. They just picked up that 5-star recruit a couple weeks ago now. They are trying to position themselves, probably what a lot of these schools, like you mentioned, Kansas and others, for this next big wave in 2030, because they know what's coming down the road. They're trying to put themselves in the best spot. And that includes in Indiana, right? They have this great season. We're going to build off this. Like, we don't want to suddenly somehow be left behind, or the others, or SMU, or all these schools. They're trying to figure out the next 5 years.
They've got to. You've got to look ahead, and you've got to adapt to the changing aspects of this business and what it means. And you can protest all you want the direction that it's going, but the flip side of it is it's not a bad thing to be centered around a college football playoff. It's not a bad thing to be centered around a regular season that points in that direction. And, I think this is a topic for the next pod that we can get into on a larger level. So much of the pushback on all of these things has come from people who seem very invested in the old system, in the bowls, in traditional rivalries. And my struggle with that is even those things haven't been around for that long. We're talking about systems that in some cases have been in place since the 80s or 90s, not things, and I'm not talking about the 1880s or 90s. I'm talking about 35, 45 years ago, which is, yes, a long time, but is a chapter in the history of the sport, not the entire history of the sport. So with all of this, there's a constant re-evolution of this sport and how it works and where its popularity lies. We heard so much for so long about how people would stop watching college football if players got paid. And then we heard, they'll stop watching if there's a playoff because the regular season will be meaningless. And neither of those things were true.
Right.
And if anything, what we saw last year was attendance and excitement about college football in places that we hadn't seen it very much over the course of the last 35, 40 years, while you still maintained the same level of interest elsewhere. And so I do think it's going to be fascinating watching all of that unfold as teams try to jockey for position and conferences try to figure out, all right, what do we do? Because as much as people have already assumed, Clemson and Florida State and UNC and Miami are going to go to the SEC, there's a lot of SEC schools who are like, why exactly are we going to be plopping Florida State right in our recruiting backyard and giving them money? Like, what are we getting out of this? Whereas the Big Ten might look at Florida State, behavioral issues aside, and wow, what a great opportunity for all of our teams to suddenly have an entry point into the Florida and Georgia markets, not just with television, but with recruiting as well.
Well, yeah, I mean, you've had Georgia Tech in that mix too, right? I mean, that was a target a couple of years ago for the Big Ten, right? So let's try to get into the Atlanta market. You're right, though. Like there is this tug of war between the old way, the old guard, if you will, but if you look at all our commissioners outside of Sankey, and I know and Jim Phillips, or sorry, two commissioners, they've been in college sports forever. Then we have two commissioners, Yarmer and Petitti, who are not college sports guys, and they're trying to push in a new wave of thinking of this is maybe potentially better, both for the landscape of college football and maybe college sports, where Sankey and Phillips are maybe a little more traditionalist, trying to navigate that road to make the sport more holistic for everybody. Now that's where I think from a standpoint, we're still trying to retrain our brain and to stop thinking about undefeated as a good season, right? Our national champion last year were 14-2. They beat 13-3 Notre Dame, right? It's gonna take a while for even us to think of that as a true change in the way we think. It took us a while, even in the 14 playoff. Oh my God, we have this +1 system. We have this, we have that. Like it takes a while for these traditionalists of college football, because it is a sport that is probably the most similar to the EPL. People really care about the sport, care about the way it's always been, and it's hard to break those things. And it's just going to take time to let these things marinate. That's why I think maybe like if the 12-team playoff goes another year or two, maybe it's a good thing. We actually see this play out instead of just saying Indiana's a problem or SMU's a problem. Well, let's see it play out. Let's see a 9-3 team get in. Let's see what happens.
Yeah, the last thing I'll say on this, and then we'll wrap up. I understand your perspective and or other people's perspectives on wanting the tradition of college football if you are a fan of a traditional college football power. And your comparison to the EPL is a really informative one, because unless you are one of the top 4 clubs in Europe, or excuse me, in England, you're probably not competing for the EPL title in any meaningful way. And that's the system that college football has had for a long time. Now, it's a slightly larger spectrum of teams, but not that much larger. And so much of this sport is conditioned and created. It's set up to keep interlopers out. Mm-hmm. If you're a Michigan fan or an Ohio State fan, I would expect you to be more defensive about the old structures and the way things used to be. If you're an Indiana fan or an Illinois fan or an Iowa fan, what the hell are you doing if you're defending the old system? Like, right. What have you ever gotten out of it? Why are
wins?
Or not in the case of Indiana and Illinois? Yeah, right. And what's fascinating to me is inadvertently we landed on something here where you actually have a chance now as a, not a top 5 or 6 program, but a team that's having a top 10, top 15 season in a given year to compete for a title. Not just a national title, but a conference title. That's never been how college football has worked. And I think that is better for the sport. It may not be better for the traditionalists. It may not be better if you're a fan of Alabama, but why should I care what a fan of Alabama thinks is best for them? Because what they think is best for them is not automatically what's best for the sport.
100%. And this is where Petitti's right. Like, you get more fan bases involved in November, right? Go back through the BCS or even the last 10 years of the college football playoff. Alabama, Clemson, Michigan, Ohio State, Alabama, Clemson. That's what it was, right? Like, you got the same matchups in the championship game or even the playoffs, right? You had the random Michigan State, or you had whatever, right? Now we're in a spot where we had a playoff last year. We had these teams that would have never had a chance. Like Indiana doesn't make Indiana's best year ever, 11-1, does not make the playoff last year in a 14 playoff. SMU's best year ever, 10-2, doesn't make the playoff. Even Penn State, they were 11-1, lost that championship game to Oregon. Ohio State, the national champ, doesn't make the playoff. Notre Dame doesn't make the playoff. So we had this great successful year, and we need to start looking more at that and stop focusing on everything else that, like, oh, this is not what it used to be. This is what it's going to be. It's going to be a 12-team or 16-team playoff with AQs or non-AQs, whatever that looks like. We need to start conditioning ourselves to understand this is better for the sport, better for the Indianas, the Kansases, the Vanderbilts, whomever, to have that one season or 2 seasons where they rise up and they can become a 6 seed or a 3 seed. And that's what's better for the sport. And that's what people need to start understanding. And even the writers the same way. Like, the way recruiting's always been covered, it's always been about those 4 teams. Well, who's having a really good year recruiting? Indiana. Yeah. Let's those things aren't being mentioned because Indiana, again, this is an Indiana podcast, but they have been the program that has the biggest target on their back because of what happened last year. And we need to start celebrating those things. I listened to something the other day. Like, the one thing college football does a poor job of is really celebrating those teams, like the Boise States that happened in the mid-2000s. They tried to push them away, and they kept pushing them away. Now we're the same with Indiana. They don't want these people in the door. Well, you know what? They're there now. And it's going to be consistently happening every single year. And you may not like that, but that's where the sport is going, and that's where it should be going, because then you keep people involved. The last thing you want is teams, or you want fans are already not going to games as much. You need fans to be in attendance. As you said, Iowa State needs people to attend games. They need people to buy tickets. And then to do that, you need to have an opportunity, which they did last year, right? They were 7-2 in the conference and 9-3 overall, whatever the record was. They were in the mix all year, got people excited about their team. That's what you need now more than ever.
We'll be back with more football weather coming up on a future episode. We're going to start talking about what Matt was referring to earlier, the lack of a dominant team potentially in college football this year, what we're seeing in terms of the key contenders at the national level, the teams that maybe will surprise people. Is there who is this year's Indiana? I don't think that there is one, but we'll try to answer that question as well. Plus, we'll have some more thoughts and comments on what's going on across the political landscape of college football, as there's a lot of NIL news, a lot of rev share news that we didn't get to this time around. Matt, any final thoughts from you before we wrap up?
No, I'm just excited to kind of get back. So I'm excited to actually talk about maybe some games and some teams. It's really, this is we're talking a lot about the business side, and we will throughout the year. But I think we're kind of excited now that we're almost in August to actually talk about the sport on the field. So
they're almost impossible to get apart from each other, the business and the actual stuff on the field. But it is coming soon. And from where we're talking today, I think we're under a month from the first college football games. So a lot to get excited about with that. For Matt Blask, I'm Galen Clavio. This is Football Weather here on the Back Home Network. We'll catch you folks on the flip side. So, everybody.